The final piece of legislation we have in front of us this evening is actually mine. It is Senate Bill 2087, the Environmental Justice Act. The Senate passed this legislation last year, but just to refresh everyone's memory, this legislation is to address the reality that as we have developed our industrial and commercial governmental polluting operations, as the tendency has been to have those facilities have all been kind of accumulated into certain areas. And unfortunately, as a result, that results in overly burdensome health burdens on certain communities, often low-income communities, often communities of color. And so this legislation is really intended to make sure that future permitting decisions about any polluting industries are taking into consideration those cumulative negative health impacts, which are often in our current system treated as externalities of our current way of being, but really have very real-world human impacts. So the legislation defines environmental justice, creates a definition for cumulative impacts. It gives community control over having the opportunity to participate in decisions about citing activities, and make sure that there's equal access to those decision-making processes. So this basically is requiring statewide planning to establish these environmental justice focus areas by criteria utilizing census data. So with that, I know we do have a number of people to testify. I'm happy to answer any questions from committee members on this legislation. Okay, seeing none. Oh, go ahead, Senator Rogers.
Yep. Just a quick review of this. According to this bill, it's going to go through statewide planning to create the list of environmental, as you explained. Yep. And I was just going over the state website. A large portion of that statewide planning committee is usually vacant spots, not filled up. So it's almost like they need to be filled up before they take on important tasks like this and fill these vacancies. So we're going to send something to a statewide environmental statewide planning that has a tremendous amount of vacancies. So I think we need to address that before we start sending stuff like this to them, so we have a more informed decision on these bills when they go through and pick these environmental justice areas. Just a point that I wanted to bring up.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any other comments or questions from committee members? Okay. Hearing none, the first public testimony we have is from Brian Moran from the New England Convenience Store and Energy Marketers.
Good evening. Appreciate the opportunity to speak before you. My name is Brian Moran. I represent the New England Convenience Store and Energy Marketers Association. Nexum is here to speak specifically about the cumulative impact analysis program as proposed in section 4217-11-3. We're not speaking to any other portions of the bill at this time at all. And really, our comments are, drawn from our experiences operating in other states that have used cumulative impact analysis or are developing it now. And what our concern really is, the question really is Rhode Island really ready for this yet? And in terms of not the capabilities of RIDEM that would be obviously tasks for the council to implement it, but really the type of staffing and resources and information technology platforms that will be needed for permit applicants to implement this program. Because a central piece of cumulative impact analysis is to be able to say, okay, what are my local burdens as I apply for this permit? I know what my permit obligations are and standards I have to meet, but also what is going on around me or my facility. And in order to get that information, the only person that can get it is the state of Rhode Island. They're the keeper of the records. And for us to go and knock on doors, that's not going to work. So the state really needs to digitize that in order to be able to make it part of a public-facing, information technology platform. And probably also just as important is to maintain that as, going forward. It's not a one and done because permits change all the time. So with that, what we would recommend and suggest for the committee, consider not the immediate adoption of cumulative impact analysis, but to lead and learn by example, where perhaps a state or municipally permitted facility that meets the criteria be used as an opportunity to better understand what the staffing needs would be, both administrative as well as technical, as well as what the information technology needs are. And without that investment and understanding, I think it's going to harm the state's regional competitiveness. And frankly, without it, without that backbone and foundation, permitting is likely to grind to a halt, particularly the larger permits that are important for the economy of the state. With that, that's the end of my testimony. Entertaining questions if you have any.
Thank you. Senator Rogers.
No, not so much a question, but again, to jump on, I'm an equal opportunity employee, as many of you may have seen tonight on some of the questions I asked, but it does seem exactly what you're saying, and I brought that up with the committees not being full on where this is going to be going. I see too many times the intent is good, the idea is good, but if it isn't there to handle it, much like I had mentioned in other committees about our power system and going green and meeting standards and guidelines that we've made law, we gotta front load it before we start pushing this stuff, and we're not prepared for it. And the problem with it is it fails at the end, and everybody starts pointing at everybody else why it's not working. So, again, this is one of those issues that I'm not so much against, but we've got to be prepared for the consequences and get things up to snuff and positions filled to handle this stuff and answer the questions that are being asked. And I just think we move too fast out of feelings. But it takes more than that when you want to get something done. You need to get, like you said, the foundation set to handle what we're going to do.
Yeah.
I mean, we're passing bills on, straws and everything else, and, there's a penalty for that, but I'm sure straws have been handed out, and how many people have been penalized? I mean, we create laws, we put in, reparations in costs of not following that, but do we follow through on that? So again, that's just the statement I want to make, and I think this is the same with a lot of things that have come through with the environmental bills. We don't have the foundation set up first, and we should know what that is, and we don't. And I just proved the perfect point on the statewide planning. It's loaded with vacancies, and these people are the ones that are going to be handling this stuff. So,
Thank you, Senator. And Chair Miller.
Could you further describe who you represent? I heard convenience stores.
Yes, I represent the New England Convenience Store and Energy Marketers Association.
So describe to me what an energy marketer.
Energy marketers are, think of a typical gas station owner, operator,
Okay.
both independent or chains, as well as wholesale distributors of motor fuel.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at the entities in which this input, the permits on page 2, starting on page 2 and going to page 3. And I'm not sure gas stations
Correct.
would fall into it. right?
Correct. Thank you. Oh,
Describe your stake in this, because I don't see either convenience stores or gas stations having a stake in this legislation based on the permits that are just listed and described that would have a stake in this process.
you bet. Thank you for the question. If you read further down in the list of permits, it also
Yeah.
describes major air source permits as
Okay.
well. And those facilities typically would include, greater than 25 tons per year emissions. And these are typically, large sources. And an example in our industry would be terminal operations.
Okay.
And that's our stake.
So you think a terminal operation, or you represent terminal operations
Yeah, they're
as
part
well
of
as
our
gas
membership.
stations?
Correct.
So I'll just give you a description of why I feel this is more urgent than waiting around, as people have described, to see what other communities and other jurisdictions do. Is that I commute to the State House and to work down Allen's Avenue. And I consider it an important community, whether it's in my district or whether it's not. And there are a lot of facilities along there. And I've participated or stood by while there have been hearings that represented those communities. And this legislation fills a gap that is urgent sooner rather than later, to have those communities better represented in those hearings. Those hearings are usually held by entities that either don't understand the impact to the surrounding community, and I've actually outlined and highlighted whether they understand those communities, and they have admitted that they don't, basically, in those hearings. And that this was new territory for them, both geographically and in where they were actually having the hearing physically off of Allen's Avenue. And so I'm really concerned about waiting to have more consideration around this while these communities continue not to be understood or represented. And so I really have a concern with that interest in waiting while these while facilities are planned in those communities with admitted regulatory bodies who say they don't understand or don't have a participation mechanism for those who will be impacted, which this bill pursues to fix.
Thank you, Chair Miller. Are there any other comments or questions? Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony. Respectfully, though, I find your critique to be kind of backwards, right? As Senator Miller was alluding to, institutions respond to laws, not the other way around. We've been waiting around for stuff like this for quite a long time. Again, as Senator Miller alluded, last year there was a conflict in his district, and in part we couldn't address that conflict because there was no legal infrastructure to address the conflict. This bill creates a legal infrastructure by which we can then hold entities accountable for their role in the community. But to me, the idea that we wait out injustice for sort of without a lever to make the state institutions assume the mantle of responsibility that they need to assume, with all due respect, is a little unrealistic to me. So I appreciate your testimony, but I have to say that I find the logic kind of inverted. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions for this witness? Okay, I do not see any. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Patrick Crowley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Patrick Crowley, and I'm the Secretary-Treasurer of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO, and I'm here on behalf of our 80,000 members across the state of Rhode Island to strongly support this legislation. I actually think one of the best parts about this is the cumulative impact studies that needs to be done, because I think for too long, in unregulated areas or minimally regulated areas of the state, pockets of polluting causing industries have been able to accumulate. And over years, decades, if not longer periods of time, we've created these areas in the state of Rhode Island that are just black holes when it comes to these types of industries. And I think it's an important feature of this legislation that making sure that cumulative effects of how these things have been able to propagate are part of the permitting process and at least part of review. And I also think that one of the best parts about this bill is the idea of involving the communities that these potential projects would be placed in. As Senator Miller just highlighted, sometimes it's not just a question of whether or not the people that are going to be making the regulatory decisions are informed enough. It's important that the people in the communities that are potentially impacted have a say and a voice in this process. And then finally, as a bit of a map geek myself, having made maps for Lincoln Woods and such not, I love the mapping work that DEM and Rhode Island Planning Department do right now. I mean, if you just go to their websites, they have amazing resources when it comes to being able to highlight, whether it's where, the best fishing areas are, whether it's the best bike paths, whether, where old growth forests are, where municipal planning offices are, whatever, there's a myriad of resources out there. And I think, knowing my experience working with the great folks at both DEM and planning, that they would have the ability to create a process here that would not only be useful and helpful to the work of this particular legislation, but adds a level of transparency to permitting processes going forward. So for all of those reasons, I'm here in support of the legislation, and wearing my dual hat as chair of Climate Jobs Rhode Island, we think this is an important part of our journey to making sure that Rhode Island is on a path to a just transition to a carbon-free economy. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for this witness? I do not see any. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Priscilla Dela Cruz.
Hello again. You can hear me well. Great. Hi, I'm Priscilla.
Is the button up on the mic?
How about now?
There you go.
Fantastic. Hi again. I'm Priscilla De La Cruz. I'm Senior Director of Government Affairs at the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. I do wear a few hats. As I mentioned earlier, I also serve as the President of the Environment Council of Rhode Island, and I also work alongside Pat Crawley as the Co-Chair of Climate Jobs Rhode Island. My testimony today is on behalf of Audubon, but I think it's important to highlight that not only does Audubon strongly support this bill, and we thank you, Chair Oyer, for introducing this bill, and also all of the co-sponsors. Thank you very much for co-sponsoring and supporting and introducing this legislation, and really the principle behind protecting communities that are overburdened by pollution. You might hear or receive separate testimony from the Environment Council of Rhode Island. This is the second year also that the Environment Council of Rhode Island has this bill on its legislative agenda. And as you heard from Pat, this is also supported by Climate Jobs Rhode Island, that partnership between environmental groups and labor groups, and is a top priority of climate jobs. So on behalf of Audubon and our 17,000 members, as I mentioned, we strongly support this bill, and we think that this is an important piece of legislation. Prior to me joining the Audubon team back in June 2020, Audubon released a strategic plan. And the strategic plan not only elevated the climate crisis to make sure that the climate lens is woven into all aspects of our work when looking at conservation, education, advocacy, but also climate justice and environmental injustice. So knowing that we have a lot of work to do to ensure that communities that are typically not at the table do have access, and that it is an inclusive movement as we work to address the climate crisis. So in that plan, basically what it comes down to is that we recognize that although access and enjoyment of clean water, clean air, and vibrant wildlife is essential and should be accessible to all and all Rhode Islanders, that is not the case. That there are many Rhode Islanders that really face a disproportionate burden when it comes to our heavily industrialized economy and continue to bear the brunt of climate change. And that has been really exacerbated throughout the pandemic. Those inequities are much deeper now. And I will just highlight a few aspects of the bill that I think are really important to Audubon. I think including CRMC in addition to DEM's programs and permitting is really important. That CRMC should be part of this evaluation when it comes to permitting. So thank you for that. Also, that it is really critical helping to ensure that no group of people continue to bear that disproportionate brunt when it comes to the negative environmental consequences resulting from the industrial, governmental, and commercial operations or policies. Third, defining environmental justice is really critical, defining that in state law, especially after the passage of the Act on Climate. And we applaud you all for passing the landmark piece of legislation that is really going to position Rhode Island for the coming decades to address the climate crisis. And one of the things within the Act on Climate is really calling for the centering of environmental justice communities or frontline communities who tend to be Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income communities, as well as frontline workers, to be centered in that process as the state works to develop climate action plans. So really defining environmental justice in state law is really critical. And I think before you, throughout the session, you'll see a number of bills that will reference environmental justice and frontline communities. So defining it and having that criteria in state law is really a dire need. Other aspects that I will highlight, I absolutely agree with Pat Crowley that we have to look at cumulative impacts. We cannot continue to look away, or we cannot continue to just say this can wait for a later day or a later session. There are communities that are suffering. There are people that are suffering. So it's really important that whenever there is a facility permit proposed in front of regulatory bodies like DEM or CRMC, that cumulative impact be assessed. It should be part of the decision. So wanted to stress that. And the third sort of point that I want to make in the third bucket that I have here is that ensuring that communities have an opportunity to participate in decisions that impact their health and their community is really critical. So I think having that in the legislation is really noteworthy, that communities, especially communities of color, they need to be at the decision-making table, and that is something that we don't see often. So I would like to also note one additional consideration, and I think this becomes even more important, hopefully crossing fingers after the passage of this Environmental Justice Act, is that we ensure that the public hearings that are happening, that are designed to make sure that the communities at the table, that they happen at a time that meets the needs of the communities. So for example, me, as an advocate, I can show up at 10 o'clock for a public hearing, but someone running a household, a working mom or father, or an individual who's working a 9 to 5 and their work falls outside of this important environmental work, and they're working to provide a home for children, for example, and you're dealing with daycare, you're not going to be able to show up at 10 o'clock. So I just wanted to stress that point because I think it sounds simple, but I think it's a very important one to ensure that working families are able to weigh in and that know what is being proposed in their community could impact them, and that they have a say in that. And also, I think that this applies to all legislation that considers environmental justice, communities, that, again, just stressing that decision-making table and ensuring that anything that moves forward, especially through our implementation, like we're seeing with the Act on Climate, that it's meeting the needs of the community, that communities of color, communities that are often not at the table feel like they're being heard and their input is included and they have a way of providing that input. And lastly, something that I typically don't do, I do want to share a personal note because I am troubled by some of the comments that I've heard and that I often hear when we're talking about frontline communities and communities of color. I am a Latina, as you can tell. I grew up in Providence, and I grew up in parts of the West End, and later on as a teenager, then throughout college in the south side of Providence. And I've seen, and I still continue to see, how a disproportionate number of my family members are impacted by pollution, by really critical health impacts like severe asthma. And I always asked myself growing up, why? And always felt, I'm sad to say this, but like the lucky one, right? Where I'm like, well, why not me? Why all of them? And a lot of communities are still facing this today. So I just urge you all to consider that when you're looking at legislation like this, because when I said in my opening statement that communities of suffering and people are suffering, I see that every day, and I've seen that every day growing up. And I think that's where, from that personal note, when we talk about these issues, they're really personal to communities of color and people of color. So I thank you all for your time today. And thank you again, Chairwoman Oyer.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions for this witness? I do not see any. Thank you so much. We have Hannah Stern listed as in support. And we have Terry Gray as written only in support, Terry Gray of the DEM, Topher Hamlet of Save the Bay.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for introducing S2087, the Environmental Justice Act. And thanks to all the co-sponsors who joined you in doing so. Everyone in the state has a right to clean air and clean water, or we should, but that's not the case. And as has been well articulated by Priscilla de la Cruz and others, some Rhode Island communities, and those are communities of color and communities of where there's intense economic stress, are unfairly carrying the burden of pollution, of cumulative impacts of pollution. And it is time for the General Assembly to step in. I want to add a bit of detail to Senator Miller, who talked about his commute to work. Along that stretch of Allens Avenue, it's about a mile, mile and a half. Think of all the different sources of pollution that exist today. There is an asphalt plant. There are diesel emissions from trucks and ships. There are petroleum facilities, terminals. There are leaking gas lines. There are scrap yards with whose dust is getting into the lungs of people who are out fishing in Narragansett Bay. And there's the background pollution, if you want to call it that, of vehicle traffic on Route 95, which is incessant. And think about how worse that is when there is a traffic jam and those vehicles are sitting on 95 idling. If there is another polluting facility proposed, what is the local community supposed to do? And I think this legislation finally, this long overdue legislation actually gives people some recourse, some playing field on which they can address cumulative impacts. I think common sense says that impacts along Allens Avenue are real, but usually permits for facilities are considered on an individual basis, and that's where the problem is. So I want to add that the science and methodology around assessing those cumulative impacts is challenging. It does require resources, no question about it, and I think that that issue hopefully could be addressed through the budget as well. For too long, the budget of DEM, the enforcement budget, the permitting and enforcement budgets have been cut. And DEM resources and capacity to address these kinds of issues we're talking about has been severely crippled. And it is time to reverse that. This legislation and the issues that it aims to address really amplify that need for stronger DEM permitting capacity and enforcement capacity as well. One note, we poked around to some other states' laws, and I call your attention to a law New Jersey passed in 2020, which actually requires the applicant of a polluting facility, of a major polluting facility, to pay for the costs associated with the review of cumulative environmental impacts. So that's something worth considering. We just saw that in the law and we thought we should bring your attention to that. So thank you for introducing this legislation. We think it's important, and the state should not just put the policy in, but also the resources behind it to really make it work for the people who it's supposed to work for. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions for this witness? Okay, I do not see any. Thank you so much, Topher.
Thank you.
We have Hank Webster, Acadia Center in support, Randall Rose of Providence in support, Michelle Bowden with Clean Water Action in support, all provided written testimony. I believe our final witness for this evening is Meg Curran from the Conservation Law Foundation. And if there is anyone else who did want to testify who's here, okay, Kai, if you want to come up as well. Yes. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself to the committee, and you can go ahead with your testimony.
Sure, thank you. My name is Kai Salem. I'm the policy coordinator at Green Energy Consumers, which is a nonprofit that works to advance the transition to a low carbon future in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. I'm also the volunteer vice president of policy at the Environment Council of Rhode Island. So I will give brief comments for ECRI, but focus on the comments from Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Both ECRI and Green Energy Consumers strongly support this bill, and we believe that it is a meaningful step forward in protecting environmental justice communities. We both believe that the definition and designation component of the legislation is especially important because in our work to prioritize environmental justice communities across environmental issue areas, whether that's the climate crisis or pollution or even other issue areas like housing and more public health, having a definition for environmental justice communities allows us to target resources and funds towards those communities. It's a way to figure out where are these places that we know have borne this historical burden and how can we make sure that they're getting the support that they need. This bill is not going to, it doesn't even come close to rectifying the historical disproportionate burdens that environmental justice communities have borne, but it is a good step towards fixing that problem going forward. We support this bill, but we also caution that we want to make sure it also has the full support of environmental justice advocates. The Environment Council of Rhode Island represents over 60 organizations in the state, as well as many individual members. But most of the environmental organizations that we represent are not environmental justice organizations, so we can't speak for them. From Green Energy Consumers' perspective, I did have some thoughts and ideas for the bill. First, the Department of Health has done a lot of work figuring out where these environmental justice areas are and how we can map and define them. So we suggest that the Department of Health be included in either the legislation or the work to designate community areas. We also had a question about the word unreasonable, which is in the permitting process based on cumulative impacts. And it might be useful for there to be some more context on what unreasonable can mean when evaluating what cumulative impacts are unreasonable. And finally, we noticed that the permit applicant is required to hold the hearing and fund the hearing. And from past experience with environmental laws and environmental citing issues, we observe that often when the company, the facility, or the permit applicant is the one that is holding the hearing, we do not actually see fair representation and a fair, good nature effort to get communities out to speak. And that concludes our comments.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions for this witness? I do not see any. Thank you, Kai. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and you can go ahead with your testimony.
Is that working? Hello, I'm Meg Curran from the Conservation Law Foundation, which James Crowell already explained more about it, environmental organization throughout New England. I want to compliment you, Senator Oyer, and the other sponsors of this bill. I don't think I have much to add. What with Kai Salem and particularly Priscilla Dela Cruz's compelling testimony on the bill, I would definitely encourage you all not to put this off again another year. I think it's important, and CLF is behind making this pass as soon as possible. It's been too long before these considerations have been put into effect. I think it is important, as Kai mentioned, that environmental justice communities themselves are on board with this and stress, as Priscilla mentioned, that it truly provides a meaningful opportunity for public input for members of the affected communities to have an opportunity to be heard and have an opportunity to participate in the proceedings. I think that that's pretty much everything. We've covered a lot, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And are there any comments or questions for this witness? Okay. I did not see any. Okay, Steve? Yep.
Hi, I wasn't originally going to speak, but I was taking notes and I thought I would jump in. Sorry. I've been part of or covered every environmental justice battle in the state over the last 6 to 8 years. I don't presume to speak for those communities, but I only want to talk about what I've seen. From National Grid's liquefaction facility expansion, greenlit by a corrupt and racist CRMC, to a large trash depot planned for the building near the port that was defeated on a legal technicality, to the recent and ongoing C3 application to expand LPG in the port, this tool is very needed. Ron Jaratowski, the head of the PUC and EFSB currently, while considering the application of C3 to expand fossil fuels in the Port of Providence, said outright at a recent hearing that the EFSB does not have to take into account cumulative impacts. Lawyers in opposition to C3 say they will try to make the case that the EFSB does have the power and responsibility to do so, but this legislation would make that clear and would be really good when we're talking about fossil fuel in the port. People in these communities are always outgunned legally. I've seen them struggle to afford representation. I've seen lawyers write up briefs and then sort of just disappear because they can no longer afford to get them there. They are always outgunned. When we're talking about people in the port or people in environmental communities that you might want to reach out to, you might think about Monica Huertas from the People's Port Authority. She should be reached out to when we're talking about this. And I also want to point out that earlier when we heard from the convenience store guy, Moran, he was representing Cumberland Farms and the big depot there, right in the port, right? No one wanted to say that, but I'm the kind of person who likes to say the obvious out loud. That's really all I have, but I really wanted to say that I don't want to talk to the details of this bill, but I really want to talk about the need for it because it is desperately needed, and anything we can do to help these communities would be really, really great. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions for this witness? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you so much. I believe that wraps up our testimony on this bill. And Chair Miller?
Yes, could I make a motion for passage?
Chair Miller makes the motion for passage, seconded by Senator Coleman, Senator DeMario, Senator Coyne, and Senator Archambault. And Madam Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Chairwoman Oyer,
Yes.
Senator DeMario,
Yes.
Senator Archambault,
Yes.
Senator Coyne,
Yes.
Senator Coleman,
Yes.
Senator Miller,
Yes.
Senator Rogers.
No.
Thank you. The bill passes with one negative vote, and we will advance this bill to the full floor of the Senate for consideration.